Rain tapped gently against the tall windows of the restaurant, blurring the neon glow of the city outside into soft streaks of red and gold. Inside, the air smelled of rosemary, seared scallops, and aged wine, comforting, expensive, and carefully curated. Crystal glasses caught the low light, and every chair had been polished that morning. It was the kind of place where people came not just to eat, but to feel like they belonged somewhere rare. At just past 7, the front door opened, and a man stepped in alone. He wore dark jeans, scuffed boots, and a well-worn leather jacket that had seen better decades. His hair was damp from the rain, and he carried no phone, no bag, no entourage. He didn't glance around dramatically or wait for someone to notice him. He simply stood near the host stand, hands in his pockets, patient and quiet. Most guests who walked through those doors announced themselves, loudly. They wore designer labels like armor, dropped names like breadcrumbs, or snapped their fingers at staff like it was their birthright. But this man, he looked like he'd just come from fixing a motorcycle or walking his dog. No fuss. No fanfare. Behind the host stand, a young waiter watched him with narrowed eyes. New to the job, only 3 weeks in, he'd already decided how the world worked here. The louder you were, the more you mattered. The flashier your watch, the faster you got seated. And this guy, he didn't fit the usual mold of the restaurant's regulars. So the waiter made a quick judgment, probably a look-alike. Or worse, a fan who'd wandered in hoping to spot someone famous. "Table for one?" the waiter asked, voice flat, already turning toward the reservation book without making eye contact. The man nodded. "Yes, please." Without a word, the waiter grabbed a single menu and gestured toward a small table tucked near the service entrance, close to the clatter of dishes, the hiss of the dishwasher, and the constant swing of the kitchen door. It wasn't the worst seat in the house, but it wasn't where you put someone you respected. It was where you put people you hoped wouldn't stay long. "Here's fine," the man said simply, sliding into the chair. He didn't complain, didn't sigh, just placed his hands on the table and looked around like he was taking in the whole room. The way the light hit the wine bottles, the murmur of conversations, the rhythm of the staff moving in practiced harmony. The waiter walked away, already scanning the room for someone more important. A group of 4 had just arrived. Suits, loud laughter. One of them flashing a platinum card like it was a trophy. The waiter rushed over, smile wide, posture eager. "Welcome. Right this way, gentlemen. We've been expecting you." Back at the quiet table, the man waited, and waited. 10 minutes passed. No water, no bread, not even a quick "I'll be right with you." He didn't tap his fingers or check his watch. He just sat, calm as still water, watching the scene unfold around him. In truth, he knew this place better than most. He'd helped choose the oak for the bar. He'd sat in on meetings about the menu, pushing for simpler dishes made with care instead of flashy ingredients no one could pronounce. He believed a restaurant should feel like a home, just one with better wine and someone else doing the dishes. But he never asked for special treatment, never wanted his name on the wall or his face in the press. He came here to eat, to think, sometimes just to be still in a world that rarely slowed down. But tonight, stillness came with a side of disrespect. Another 10 minutes ticked by. A busser passed by and gave the man an apologetic glance, but didn't stop. The head server noticed too. She'd seen him here before, always polite, always generous with his tip, always alone. She frowned, about to say something, but the manager was deep in conversation with the loud group at table 12 and waved her off. "Not now," he mouthed. So the silence stretched. Finally, the young waiter circled back. Not because he remembered, but because his section was slow for a moment. He stopped short when he saw the man still sitting there. Untouched water glass, untouched bread basket, untouched dignity. "Oh, you're still here," he said, more surprised than sorry. The man looked up, eyes kind but steady. "I was hoping to order." The waiter shrugged, pulling out his notepad like it was a chore. "Sorry, we've been slammed." "What'll it be?" "No, sir. No welcome. Just brisk, almost bored efficiency." The man ordered a simple pasta, house-made tagliatelle with butter and sage, and a glass of red. Nothing fancy, nothing that screamed celebrity order. The waiter scribbled it down without looking up, then turned on his heel. As he walked away, he muttered under his breath to a coworker, "Can you believe that guy? Walks in like he owns the place." The coworker didn't answer. She just watched the man at the small table, who now stared out the window at the rain. completely unaware, or perhaps completely unbothered, that his presence had just become the night's quiet drama. Outside, the city kept moving. Cars splashed through puddles. People hurried under umbrellas. But inside, something subtle had shifted. Not in the lighting, not in the music, but in the air. Like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The man took a slow breath of his own. He wasn't angry. Disappointment, maybe. But more than that, he felt a quiet sadness. For the waiter, for the restaurant, for the way people so often confuse appearance with worth. He'd been on the other side of that mistake plenty of times in his life. Early on, when he was starting out, he'd been turned away from places for not dressing right, for not sounding right, for simply not looking like what people expected. He remembered how it felt, like being told you didn't belong just for being yourself. Now, decades later, he owned part of this very room. Not for the power, not for the prestige, but because he believed in what it could be, a place where everyone, no matter how they dressed or what they drove, could sit down and feel seen. But tonight, that belief was being tested. The kitchen called out his order. The waiter grabbed the plate without a glance at the ticket, balancing it carelessly as he weaved through the dining room. When he reached the table, he set the dish down with a soft clink, barely making eye contact. "Here you go," he said, already stepping back. The man looked at the pasta, perfectly cooked, just as he liked it, and then back at the waiter. "Thank you," he said, voice calm, sincere. The waiter blinked. He hadn't expected gratitude. He'd expected a complaint, maybe even a scene, but there was none. Just quiet thanks, like the man genuinely meant it. For the first time all night, the waiter hesitated. Something about that simple thank you didn't fit the story he'd told himself. But before he could process it, a voice called from across the room. Another table needed help. He turned and walked away again. And the man? He picked up his fork, took a bite, and let the warmth of the meal settle into him. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, the night was far from over. The pasta steamed gently on the plate, the butter glistening under the soft light. The man ate slowly, savoring each bite like it was a small gift. Around him, the restaurant hummed with its usual rhythm, glasses clinking, low laughter, the occasional burst of conversation rising above the murmur. But at his table near the back, near the kitchen door that swung open every few minutes with a puff of warm air and the clatter of trays, there was only quiet. The young waiter didn't return. Not to check if the food was okay. Not to refill the water glass, still empty since the man had arrived. Not even to clear the bread plate that had never been used. He was too busy hovering around the group in the center of the room, the ones with loud voices and expensive watches, who kept snapping their fingers and calling, "Hey, buddy, over here!" like they were summoning a dog. Each time the waiter rushed over to them, he smiled wide, laughed at their jokes a little too loudly, and leaned in like he was part of their inner circle. He brought extra appetizers on the house, refilled wine glasses before they were half empty, and made sure their photos for social media had perfect lighting. Meanwhile, the man at the back table remained invisible, but he wasn't alone in noticing. A veteran server, someone who'd worked there since the place first opened, paused near the bar and watched the scene unfold. She'd seen the man come in many times before, always alone, always polite, always leaving a tip that made her eyes widen. She remembered one night he'd stayed late just to help her carry heavy trays to the storage room, when the dishwasher had called in sick. No fanfare, no "look what I'm doing," just quiet help. She glanced toward the manager, who was standing near the host stand, scrolling on his phone. She opened her mouth to say something, maybe just a gentle nudge like, "You know who's sitting at table 9? But stopped herself. The manager had been distant lately, more focused on numbers than people. And she didn't want to cause trouble. So she stayed silent, though it sat heavy in her chest. Back at the table, the man finished his meal. He set his fork down neatly, wiped his mouth with the napkin, and looked around again, not with impatience, but with something closer to curiosity. He watched how the staff moved, how some guests were treated like royalty while others were barely acknowledged. He saw the exhaustion in the eyes of the busser, the forced cheer in the hostess's voice, the way the young waiter's eagerness had twisted into something sharper, something performative. He didn't take it personally. He'd been in enough rooms to know how easy it was to misread someone. But he also knew that how a place treated its least flashy guests said everything about its soul. Still, the silence stretched. No one came to ask if he wanted dessert. No one offered coffee. No one even glanced his way. At one point, the young waiter passed by so close he nearly brushed the table. The man looked up, ready to ask for the check, but the waiter didn't slow down. Instead, he muttered something under his breath, just loud enough to carry. Must be nice to sit around all night doing nothing. The words hung in the air for a second, sharp and unnecessary. A nearby bartender heard it. He stiffened, then shot the waiter a look that said, "You have no idea." But he said nothing. The kitchen staff, peering out through the pass, exchanged glances. One cook shook his head slowly and went back to plating. The man didn't react. He just sat there, hands folded on the table, gaze steady. There was no anger in his eyes, just a deep, quiet disappointment. Not because he'd been slighted, but because the restaurant he'd helped build was starting to forget what it stood for. He remembered the early days, before the Michelin mentions and the celebrity sightings. Back then, the owner, his friend, had sat with him in this very space when it was still just bare walls and dreams. They'd talked for hours about creating a place where kindness wasn't a performance but a practice, where the dishwasher and the diner were treated with the same basic respect. Hospitality isn't about who you serve, his friend had said. It's about how you see people. Now that vision felt frayed at the edges. The man reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small notebook, and wrote something down. Not a complaint, just a thought. Then he closed it and slipped it back inside. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The city lights shimmered on wet pavement. Inside, the energy shifted as the dinner rush began to wind down. The loud group finally left, laughing and clinking glasses as they stumbled out the door. The young waiter watched them go with a satisfied smile, like he'd just won something. But his victory was short-lived. As he turned back toward the dining room, he froze. The manager was standing by table 9, not just standing, bending slightly, speaking in a low, urgent tone. And the man at the table? He was nodding calmly, like this was the most normal thing in the world. The waiter's stomach dropped. He hadn't seen the manager come over. Hadn't seen him recognize the guest. Hadn't seen the moment everything changed. Now the manager was gesturing toward the kitchen, then toward the staff, his face tight with something between panic and regret. The man just listened, then said a few quiet words that made the manager nod even more deeply. The young waiter stood rooted in place, heart pounding. He replayed every moment, the dismissive glance, the ignored water glass, the muttered comment. Each one now felt like a stone in his shoe, heavy and impossible to ignore. A senior server walked past and gave him a look, not angry, but sad. "You really didn't know, did you?" The waiter opened his mouth, but no words came out. Of course he didn't know. How could he? The man never acted like someone important. He didn't demand attention. He didn't wear his fame like a crown. He just showed up like anyone else, hoping for a good meal and a little peace. But in this world, where status was measured by noise and flash, that kind of quiet presence was easy to overlook. Too easy. Now the truth was out, and the restaurant, once buzzing with self-assurance, felt suddenly still. Even the kitchen seemed quieter, as if everyone was holding their breath. The man stood up. He didn't make a scene, didn't raise his voice. He simply thanked the manager, shook his hand, and walked toward the coat check like he was leaving after any ordinary night. But nothing about this night was ordinary. As he passed the young waiter, their eyes met for just a second. The waiter braced for a glare, a sharp word, maybe even a threat, but instead the man gave a small, almost imperceptible nod like he understood. Like he'd been there too. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. The waiter stood there, surrounded by the clink of dishes and the low hum of cleanup, feeling smaller than he had in years. Not because he'd been caught being rude, but because he'd failed at the one thing this place was supposed to be about, seeing people for who they really were. And the worst part? He hadn't even realized he'd looked away. The restaurant felt different after he left, not because the lights dimmed or the music changed, but because the air itself seemed heavier, like everyone was walking on tiptoes around a truth they hadn't fully processed yet. The young waiter stood frozen near the empty table, his mind racing. He kept replaying every interaction, every careless word, every time he'd walked past without so much as a glance. His chest tightened with a mix of shame and disbelief. How could I not have known? But the real shock hadn't even hit yet. Just minutes after the front door closed behind the quiet guest, the manager's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, paled slightly, and immediately straightened his tie. "He's coming back," he muttered more to himself than anyone else. "And he's not alone." Within 10 minutes, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. The door opened and out stepped the same man. But this time, beside him was the restaurant's founding partner, the one whose name was on the lease, whose vision had shaped every detail from the tile in the entryway to the playlist that hummed softly overhead. They walked in together, calm and unhurried, like they were returning from a casual evening stroll, not stepping into what felt like a courtroom. The entire staff stopped what they were doing. Glasses paused mid-wipe. Trays hovered in midair. Even the dishwasher peered out from the kitchen doorway. The two men didn't head to a table. Instead, they walked straight to the center of the dining room, where the manager stood waiting, hands clasped tightly in front of him. There were no raised voices, no dramatic accusations. Just quiet conversation, low enough that only those closest could catch fragments. Standards, culture, what we promised. The young waiter hovered near the bar, heart pounding. He wanted to disappear. He wanted to explain. He wanted to rewind the night and do it all over again, this time with open eyes and a quieter ego. One of the veteran servers approached him gently. "Go change your apron," she said softly, "and take a breath. This isn't the end," but it felt like it. As the two owners spoke with the manager, the rest of the staff exchanged glances full of worry and regret. They all knew the truth now. The man they'd dismissed wasn't just a famous face who occasionally dropped by. He was one of the people who'd believed in this place enough to invest not just money, but heart. He'd sat in on hiring meetings, pushed for fair wages, and insisted the staff meal be as thoughtfully prepared as the guest menu. He didn't do it for headlines. He did it because he remembered what it felt like to be on the other side of the service line. Overlooked. Underpaid, treated like background noise. Now, that same man had been treated like an inconvenience in his own house. After a few minutes, the founding partner stepped away to speak with the kitchen team, leaving the other man standing alone near the host stand. He looked around the room, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet sadness, like he was seeing cracks in something he'd helped build. Then his eyes landed on the young waiter. The waiter's breath caught. He expected a summons, a reprimand, maybe even a demand that he be let go on the spot. Instead, the man simply walked over. Up close, he looked tired, but not unkind. His eyes held no judgment, just a deep, steady calm. "Can we talk for a minute?" he asked, voice low. The waiter nodded, throat too tight to speak. They stepped into the small staff lounge off the kitchen, a plain room with a worn couch, a coffee maker, and a bulletin board covered in schedules and notes. The door clicked shut behind them, muffling the sounds of the restaurant. For a long moment, neither spoke. The waiter stared at his shoes, bracing for the worst. Then the man sat down on the edge of the couch and patted the space beside him. "Sit." The waiter hesitated, then obeyed. "I've been where you are," the man said finally. "Early in my career, I walked into a place thinking I had to prove I belonged. I talked too loud, dressed too flashy, acted like I knew everything. And you know what? People saw right through it. They treated me like a joke." He paused, looking not at the waiter but at the floor, like he was remembering something distant. "It wasn't until someone, a doorman actually, treated me like a real person, not a performance, that I realized how exhausting it is to pretend. And how powerful it is to just see someone." The waiter swallowed hard. "I didn't mean to—" "You didn't know," the man interrupted gently. "That's the thing. You made an assumption. We all do, but here, in this place, we try to do better. Because everyone who walks through that door, whether they're wearing a tuxedo or a raincoat, deserves to feel welcome." The waiter's eyes stung. Not from fear now, but from something deeper. Regret mixed with a sudden sharp understanding. He'd been so focused on impressing the important guests that he'd forgotten the most basic rule of hospitality. Treat people like people. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The man nodded. "I know, and that matters." Just then the manager opened the door, looking anxious. "He's asking if you want to handle this." "Officially," the man shook his head. "No official anything. This isn't about punishment. It's about learning. He stood, then turned to the waiter. You're good at your job. I've seen you work. You're quick, you're sharp, but don't let ambition blind you to kindness. That's the real currency here. Outside the lounge, the restaurant had gone quiet. The staff waited, not with fear, but with a kind of hopeful tension, like they were watching a storm pass and wondering what the sky would look like after. The man walked back through the dining room, gave a small wave to the kitchen team, and exchanged a few final words with the founding partner. Then, without fanfare, he left again, this time for good. But something had shifted. The manager called a quick huddle. No yelling, no blame. Just a simple reminder. This place only works if we remember why we're here. Not for tips, not for Instagram. For people. The young waiter stood at the edge of the group listening. For the first time, he didn't feel like he had to perform. He just felt seen. And in that moment, he made a silent promise. Not to a celebrity, not to a boss, but to himself. Next time, he'd look closer. He'd listen better. He'd remember that worth isn't written on a jacket or a watch. It's in how someone treats the person who can do nothing for them. The night ended with the usual cleanup. Dishes stacked. Chairs flipped onto tables, floors swept. But the mood was different. Lighter somehow. Like the air had been cleared of something heavy. As the last light clicked off and the door locked behind them, the young waiter walked out into the cool night. Rain long gone, stars just beginning to show. He didn't feel like a failure. He felt like someone who'd been given a second chance, and that, he realized, was rarer than any tip. The days that followed were quiet, but not the kind of quiet that feels empty. It was the kind that comes after a storm, calm, clear, and full of space to think. The young waiter showed up for his shifts like always, but something in him had changed. He still moved quickly, still remembered orders without writing them down, still knew which wine paired with the duck, but now he looked people in the eye. Not to size them up, but to really see them. He started small. He brought water to every table the moment guests sat down, no matter how they were dressed. He asked how their day was going, and actually waited for the answer. When a couple came in wearing raincoats and carrying grocery bags, he didn't steer them toward the back. He gave them a window seat and said, "You picked a good night to get out of the house." The other staff noticed. Not with words, but with nods. With the way they'd hand him a clean towel without being asked or cover his station when he needed a break. Trust once broken doesn't come back all at once, but it starts with a single honest gesture. Meanwhile, the man, the one who owned part of the restaurant, didn't return right away. Some wondered if he'd decided to stay away for good, but the founding partner kept things steady, holding brief team huddles before each shift, reminding everyone. We serve people, not personas. No grand speeches. Just simple truths repeated like a heartbeat. Then, one Tuesday evening, just as the dinner rush began to build, the front door opened again. He walked in alone, same as before. Jeans, leather jacket, no entourage. Rain hadn't followed him this time, but the city air clung to his sleeves like a memory. He paused just inside, scanning the room not like a celebrity checking for fans, but like someone returning to a place he cared about. The hostess, who'd been there since opening night, smiled the moment she saw him. Your usual table? She asked softly. He nodded. If it's free. She led him not to the back corner near the kitchen, but to a quiet booth by the window, his real usual spot, the one he'd never been offered on that first night. The young waiter saw him enter from across the room. His stomach fluttered, not with fear this time, but with something like hope. He didn't rush over. He finished taking an order at another table, made sure the bread basket was full, checked that the water pitchers were refilled. Then, when the moment felt right, he walked over. Welcome back, he said, voice steady. The man looked up and smiled. Small but real. Good to be back. There was no mention of what had happened. No awkward apology, no heavy silence. Just two people meeting again, both a little wiser. I'll bring you the house red, the waiter said. Unless you'd like to try the new Pinot. The man raised an eyebrow, surprised. You remembered I like Pinot? I pay better attention now, the waiter said simply. A pause. Then the man nodded. Pinot it is. As the waiter turned to go, the man added, and maybe some of that sourdough? The one with the sea salt? The waiter smiled. Already on its way. Back at the pass, the kitchen staff exchanged glances. One cook grinned and slid a small plate of warm bread onto the counter. "Tell him it's on me," he said. The meal that followed wasn't rushed. The waiter checked in just enough, never hovering, never disappearing. He brought the wine, described the notes without sounding like he was reading a script, and left the bottle on the table with the cork beside it, the way the man liked. When the main course came, a simple grilled fish with roasted vegetables, he set it down gently and said, "Chef added lemon confit. Said you'd appreciate it." The man took a bite, closed his eyes for half a second, then gave a quiet, "Perfect," later. As the restaurant settled into its late-night rhythm, the manager approached the booth. He looked nervous, like he was bracing for feedback. But the man waved him closer and said, "Everything's good. Really good." The manager exhaled, shoulders dropping. "We've been trying." "I know," the man said, "and it shows." After dessert, a modest panna cotta, no fanfare, the man asked for the check. The waiter brought it on a small tray. No flourish, just respect. As the man reached for his wallet, he paused. "You know," he said, "I used to think owning a place like this meant control, but I've learned it's really about responsibility. To the food, to the staff, to the guests, especially the ones who don't look like they belong." The waiter met his gaze. "I get that now." "I hope you do," the man said, "because places like this, they only work when everyone remembers they're part of something bigger than themselves." He left a generous tip, as always, but this time, tucked under the bill, was a small note. The waiter didn't read it until after the man had left. It said, "Kindness is a habit, not a performance. Keep practicing." He folded the note and put it in his pocket right over his heart. That night after closing, the staff stayed a little longer than usual. No one said much. They just cleaned side by side, the clink of glasses and the hum of the dishwasher filling the space where tension used to live. The young waiter scrubbed down his station slowly, thoughtfully. He wasn't thinking about tips or promotions or who might be watching. He was thinking about how it felt to do something right. Not for reward, but because it was the right thing. The next morning, he arrived early. Before his shift, he made a pot of coffee and left a fresh cup on the manager's desk with a sticky note. "Thanks for giving me room to grow." By the time lunch service began, the restaurant felt different. Not because of any grand change, but because of 100 small ones. A busser was greeted by name. A regular was asked about her grandchild. A nervous first-time diner was reassured with a warm smile. And in the middle of it all, the young waiter moved with a new kind of confidence, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that listens. He still made mistakes. Once he mixed up 2 orders. Another time he forgot to refill a water glass. But now when he apologized, it came from a place of care, not panic. And people responded in kind. Weeks passed. The city kept turning. Celebrities came and went. But the real story wasn't in the famous faces, it was in the quiet shift of how people treated each other behind the scenes. And when the man returned again, this time on a sunny Thursday afternoon, he didn't need to say a word. The way the staff greeted him, the way his table was ready before he even walked in, the way the young waiter brought his coffee exactly how he liked it. It all said everything. No one bowed. No one fawned. They just honored him by honoring the values he'd helped plant there. Because in the end, the most powerful thing you can own isn't a building or a brand. It's the way you make people feel when you walk into a room, and the way you leave it better than you found it. Months had passed since that rainy night, and the restaurant had settled into a new rhythm, one quieter, steadier, and somehow more alive. The change wasn't in the menu or the decor. It was in the way people moved through the space, slower, more present, like they weren't just passing through but actually belonging. The young waiter, once eager to chase the spotlight of the loudest tables, now found his satisfaction in the small moments. The quiet thank you from an elderly couple, the relieved smile of a parent whose toddler had finally eaten something green, the nod of recognition from a regular who came in just for the soup. He still wore the same uniform, still clocked the same hours, but something inside him had shifted. He no longer saw guests as opportunities to impress or obstacles to endure. He saw them as people, each with their own story, their own weight, their own need to feel seen, even for just an hour over dinner. And then, one unremarkable Wednesday evening, the man returned. No announcement, no ripple of whispers this time. He simply walked in during the soft lull between lunch and dinner, when the kitchen was prepping for the night and the dining room held only a few lingering guests. He wore the same worn leather jacket, the same calm expression. The hostess saw him, smiled, and without a word, led him to his favorite booth by the window, the one with the best view of the streetlights flickering on as dusk settled over the city. The young waiter was wiping down the bar when he spotted him. His pulse didn't race like it used to. There was no panic, no rehearsed apology waiting on his tongue, just a quiet sense of familiarity, like seeing an old friend you hadn't realized you'd missed. He finished drying the glass in his hand, set it down carefully, and walked over. "Back again," he said, not as a question, but as a welcome. The man looked up and smiled. "Miss the bread." They both knew it wasn't really about the bread. The waiter nodded. "Fresh batch came out 10 minutes ago. Sea salt and everything. Perfect. No fanfare. No ceremony. Just two people who'd shared something real, meeting again in the ordinary flow of life." As the evening unfolded, the restaurant filled slowly. A couple celebrating an anniversary, a group of friends laughing over shared plates, a solo diner reading a book with a glass of wine. The young waiter moved among them all with the same care, never rushing, never favoring, just offering presence. He brought extra napkins without being asked. He remembered who liked their water with lemon and who preferred it still. He even crouched down to tie the shoelace of a little girl whose parents were distracted by their conversation. From his booth, the man watched it all. Not with judgment, but with something close to pride. Not because the waiter was serving him differently, but because he was serving everyone the same way, with dignity. Later, when the man ordered as usual, grilled fish, roasted vegetables, a glass of Pinot, the kitchen prepared it with quiet care. The chef even added a sprig of fresh dill, knowing it was a favorite. When the plate arrived, the man took a bite, closed his eyes for half a second, and gave a small, satisfied nod. The young waiter saw it. And for the first time, he didn't feel nervous about getting it right. He just felt glad he could be part of making someone's evening a little better. After dinner, as the man sipped his espresso, the manager stopped by, not to check on things, but to share a quiet word. "We've had fewer complaints this quarter than ever," he said, and more handwritten notes from guests saying they felt at home. The man looked around the room, the warm light, the low hum of conversation, the staff moving with ease rather than anxiety. "That's the goal," he said simply. When it was time to leave, the man stood, slipped on his jacket, and paused by the waiter's station. He didn't hand over a note this time. He didn't need to. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth stone. Nothing fancy, just something he'd picked up on a walk. He placed it gently on the counter. "For your pocket," he said, "to remind you that even the smallest things can carry weight." The waiter picked it up. It was cool to the touch, worn smooth by time and water. He closed his fingers around it and nodded. "Thank you." The man gave one last look around, taking in the space he'd helped build, not with money alone, but with belief, and then walked out into the evening. The young waiter watched him go, then slipped the stone into his apron pocket, right where he kept his pen and his notepad. It wasn't a trophy. It wasn't a token of fame. It was a reminder that how you treat people matters more than who they are. In the weeks that followed, the restaurant didn't become famous for that night. There were no viral videos, no headlines, but something deeper took root. New staff were trained not just on how to fold napkins or recite the wine list, but on how to listen, how to notice, how to make someone feel like they mattered, even if they never came back. The young waiter eventually became a trainer himself. When a new hire asked him what the secret was to good service, he didn't talk about speed or charm. He said, "Pay attention, not to what people wear or how much they spend. Pay attention to who they are." And sometimes, when the dining room was full and the kitchen was humming and everything felt just right, he'd reach into his pocket, feel the smooth stone, and remember that night, not as a moment of shame, but as a turning point. Because real change doesn't happen in grand gestures. It happens in quiet choices. The choice to see someone, the choice to apologize, the choice to try again. The man never owned the restaurant in the way people think of ownership, with signs and speeches and control. He owned it in the way that mattered, by caring enough to show up, even when no one knew who he was. And in the end, that was the real lesson, not just for the waiter, but for anyone who's ever judged a book by its cover or assumed that worth wears a certain kind of face. The city kept turning. People kept coming and going. But inside that restaurant, something had been restored. The simple, powerful truth that kindness isn't weakness, it's the strongest foundation you can build on. And every night, when the last guest left and the lights dimmed, the staff didn't just clean tables. They honored a promise to each other, to their guests, and to the quiet belief that everyone, no matter how they arrive, deserves to leave feeling a little more human. That's the kind of place it had become, not because of fame, but because of heart.